The morning began like so many others in the South Loop of Chicago. The sky was soft with the pale light of early September, the streets humming with the muffled sounds of school traffic. Parents called after their children, car doors opened and closed, sneakers tapped against concrete. Somewhere a bell rang, and then just moments later, a single gunshot shattered it all. In that instant, everything changed. Romeca Meeks Blackman was 31 years old, a devoted mother, a woman known for her smile, her determination, her quiet strength. That morning, she did what millions of parents do every day. She kissed her young son goodbye at the curb, promised to see him later, and watched him disappear through the school doors. She was supposed to walk back to her car and drive off to the rest of her day. Instead, she collapsed on the sidewalk, her life torn away in front of parents, children, and teachers who will never unsee what they witnessed. They say tragedy strikes when no one expects it. But this wasn't just a sudden flash of violence. This was personal, and it happened in the one place a mother should feel safe, outside her child's school. Witnesses remember the scream before the shot. They remember Romeca standing, defiant, in a brief clash with a woman she knew. They remember the woman reaching into her clothing, the sharp motion, the flash of metal, and the deafening crack of the gun. And then, silence. Only the distant echo of children's voices on the other side of the school doors. Romeca was rushed to Stroger Hospital, but her injuries were catastrophic. Doctors fought to save her, they could not. Within hours, her name appeared in headlines, not as the proud mother she had been, but as the victim of a shooting described by authorities as domestic in nature. Her family is shattered. Her son is without his mother. And somewhere in this city, the woman who pulled the trigger is being questioned, her name whispered through corridors as investigators piece together what happened and why. This is not just the story of a life lost. It is the story of a warning unheeded, of tensions that quietly followed her until they caught her on the sidewalk that morning. And now, a family is left asking the question no one can yet answer. Was this an explosion of rage, or a plan carried out with cold intention? If you appreciate in-depth, respectful explorations of true crime cases, subscribe now and hit the bell so you don't miss what really happened that morning. Because stories like this matter, and if we forget them, they'll just become another headline. Don't let Romeca's story be forgotten. Romeca Meeks Blackman was not just a name in a headline. She was a mother, a daughter, a sister, and a friend. Those who knew her describe her as vibrant, someone who carried herself with quiet pride, who lived for her son and worked tirelessly to give him a better future than the one she had known. She grew up in Chicago, navigating its struggles, determined not to be defined by them. Her world revolved around her child, and every decision she made seemed anchored in that single purpose: to protect him, to guide him, to give him everything she never had. But behind the life she built, tensions lingered. There were whispers among friends about strained relationships and past conflicts tied to her son's father. Conversations turned tense when his name surfaced, and people noticed the way her tone shifted when she spoke of him. Their relationship had ended long before that September morning, yet the threads between them were not fully severed. Complications remained, about parenting, about loyalty, about trust, and hovering at the edges was another woman, someone Romeca knew, someone tied to that same man, someone who, according to those close to her, seemed to carry a quiet resentment that never quite faded. On the morning of September 9th, 2025, the sun rose like any other day over the South Loop. Romeca dressed her son for school, packed his bag, and walked him out the door. To passing strangers, they would have looked like any mother and son starting their day, the kind of fleeting moment no one expects to remember. They drove through the busy Chicago streets, surrounded by the soft rhythm of city life waking up. Nothing about that drive hinted at what was waiting on the other side. They pulled up to the school just after the first bell. Parents were gathered in small knots on the sidewalk, children running toward the doors. Romeca parked, stepped out, took her son's hand, and walked him to the entrance. She knelt to hug him goodbye, straightened his collar, and smiled as he disappeared inside. It was the kind of goodbye she had done countless times, not knowing it would be the last. As she turned back toward her car, another figure emerged from the crowd. A woman, someone she recognized. Witnesses say their eyes locked, and in that moment, everything around them seemed to still. Words were exchanged, low at first, then sharper. The two moved closer, tension tightening like a wire between them. Then, without warning, it erupted. A sudden lunge, a flash of metal, one deafening shot. Romeca fell instantly. Screams echoed across the sidewalk as children froze, wide-eyed behind the school's glass doors. And in that brief, irreversible instant, a young boy inside the building lost his mother forever. Chaos erupted in the seconds after the shot. Parents who had been chatting only moments earlier scrambled for cover, clutching their children, shielding their eyes. Car alarms wailed as someone slammed a fist against a hood in panic. A backpack lay abandoned on the pavement where a child had dropped it in terror. And in the center of it all, Romeca Meeks Blackman lay motionless on the cold concrete, her body crumpled, her life hanging by a thread. The woman who had pulled the trigger stood frozen for a moment, the weapon still clutched in her hand. Witnesses remember her expression, not wild, not panicked, but blank, almost distant, as if she were watching from somewhere far away. Then, without a word, she turned and walked briskly toward a waiting car. Doors slammed, tires screeched, and she was gone, leaving only silence behind her and a growing pool of blood at Romeca's feet. Bystanders rushed forward, voices trembling as they called 911. A man took off his jacket, pressing it desperately against the wound on Romeca's face. Others shouted for help toward the school doors, where staff hurried to pull children away from the windows. Within minutes, the shriek of approaching sirens cut through the air, and paramedics were on the ground, lifting Romeca's fragile body onto a stretcher. Her chest rose and fell in shallow gasps as they loaded her into the ambulance. Police swarmed the scene, cordoning off the sidewalk with yellow tape, marking blood drops with small numbered placards, and collecting the fragments of a life shattered in an instant. Shell casings glimmered near the curb. A cell phone lay cracked and smeared with blood. A small stuffed keychain, her son's, dangled from the strap of her handbag, swinging gently in the breeze. As the ambulance pulled away, one mother standing nearby whispered, "She just dropped off her boy." Her voice cracked on the last word. Everyone heard it. Everyone felt the weight of it. At Stroger Hospital, doctors worked frantically to save her. The bullet had entered her face at close range, causing catastrophic injuries. Despite their efforts, her condition deteriorated rapidly. Family members were called, their cries echoing down the sterile white hallways as they arrived. They begged to see her, begged for a miracle, begged for time. But within hours, Romeca was pronounced dead. Back at the school, news crews began to gather, their cameras pointed toward the crime scene as children were quietly escorted outside doors to waiting parents. The word spread fast, through texts, social media, and whispered phone calls. A mother had been murdered at school drop-off, and the woman who pulled the trigger, someone Romeca knew, was still out there, somewhere, as detectives scrambled to piece together what had just torn their community apart. Detectives from the Chicago Police Department's Homicide Division arrived within the hour, stepping over the taped perimeter with grim faces. They moved methodically, snapping photographs, collecting witness statements, and reviewing nearby surveillance cameras mounted on the school and neighboring businesses. Their radios crackled with clipped instructions as they secured the scene, careful not to contaminate the evidence. To them, this was now more than a tragedy. It was a homicide, and they needed answers fast. Witnesses were led aside one by one. Some were still trembling, their voices faltering as they described the confrontation. Two women arguing sharply, Romeca standing her ground, and then the sudden flash of the gun. Several parents recognized the shooter, saying she had ties to Romeca's child's father. That revelation sent a ripple of quiet alarm through the detectives. This wasn't random. This was personal, and if it was connected to an ongoing conflict, the threat might not be over. Inside the school, administrators tried to shield the children from what had unfolded just feet from their doors. Teachers whispered hurried instructions, closing blinds, turning on music, doing anything to mask the outside chaos. Some children had seen everything through the glass. Their small faces were pale, their eyes fixed on the empty spot where Romeca had fallen. Counselors were called in, but the shock clung to the air like a heavy fog. Meanwhile, at Stroger Hospital, Romeca's family gathered in a small waiting room, clutching each other in disbelief. They had rushed there the moment they heard. Some still didn't know the full truth yet, only that she had been shot, that she was hurt. When the doctor stepped in and quietly told them she hadn't made it, the room erupted in grief. Her mother collapsed to the floor. Her sister screamed her name over and over, and somewhere her young son was still at school, unaware that his mother was gone. Back at the scene, detectives pieced together the shooter's escape. Cameras showed her fleeing in a dark-colored vehicle, its plates partially obscured. Officers traced the car to a known associate of Romeca's former partner. They worked through the afternoon and into the night, conducting interviews, issuing warrants, and combing through social media messages that hinted at long-standing resentment between the two women. Screenshots revealed heated exchanges, accusations, insults, and veiled threats that now took on a chilling new weight. As daylight faded, the memorial began. Neighbors placed candles and flowers near the spot where Romeca fell. Photographs of her smiling with her son appeared beside them, fluttering in the cool evening breeze. People gathered in silence, their faces lit by candlelight, some whispering prayers, others simply staring at the pavement as if trying to understand how something so violent could happen on such an ordinary morning. And above them, the school stood quiet, its halls dark, its windows reflecting the flicker of grief below. As night deepened over Chicago, the investigation intensified. Detectives gathered in a dimly lit conference room at the precinct, spreading out photographs, timelines, and phone records across the table. They spoke in low, deliberate tones, replaying the few seconds of security footage over and over. The blurred figure of the shooter approaching, the argument, the muzzle flash, and then the quick retreat toward the getaway car. They froze the footage at the exact moment her face turned toward the camera. It was grainy, but just clear enough. They believed they knew who she was. Her name was passed quietly between the officers, a woman connected to the father of Romeca's child. Witnesses had confirmed it. Neighbors had whispered about long-standing tension, jealousy, and confrontations in the past. This was not a random act. This was rooted in something older, and perhaps darker, than a single moment of rage. By midnight, warrants were signed. Phones were pinged. Detectives tracked her digital footprint, recent calls, social media activity, movements in the hours before and after the shooting. What they found painted a chilling picture. She had been near the school long before Romeca arrived that morning. She had parked her car several blocks away, watching from a distance. That revelation hardened the air in the room. This was beginning to look like premeditation. While the manhunt unfolded, Romeca's home stood silent, her son asleep at a relative's house, unaware that his life had been split into a before and after. Family members moved through her rooms softly, as though afraid to disturb her presence still lingering in the air. Her favorite perfume on the dresser, her son's drawings taped to the fridge, her shoes lined neatly by the door, as if she might walk in at any moment. At dawn, officers converged on an apartment on the city's south side. Neighbors were startled awake by the flash of red and blue lights cutting through their curtains. The suspect's vehicle sat parked outside. Moments later, the door was forced open and officers swept inside. She was there, calm, silent. As they placed her in handcuffs, she offered no resistance, no words, only a blank stare. By morning, news outlets across the city were ablaze with the story. Headlines blared from every screen. Mother gunned down at school drop-off. Photographs of Romeca smiling beside her young son appeared beside grainy mugshots of the woman accused of ending her life. The contrast was jarring, a warm, loving mother against the cold, expressionless face of the alleged killer. Outside the school, the memorial grew. More flowers, more candles, handwritten notes from children who barely understood what had happened. And in the soft light of sunrise, the city seemed to hold its breath, waiting for justice to begin its slow, uncertain march. The courtroom atmosphere grew more suffocating with each passing day of testimony. and by the time the trial reached its midpoint, the tension was unbearable. The prosecution meticulously unraveled the web of jealousy and betrayal that had led to Romeca Meeks' tragic death, and each witness they brought forward seemed to add another nail to the coffin of the accused. Former friends of the love triangle's central figures took the stand, reluctantly recounting late-night confessions, whispered arguments, and the toxic power struggles that had brewed behind closed doors. One woman testified that just days before the murder, she had overheard a chilling conversation in which one of the lovers threatened, "If I can't have her, no one will." Those words hung in the air like a spectre, echoing through the courtroom as the jury scribbled furiously on their notepads. Meanwhile, the defense struggled to counter the avalanche of evidence. They attempted to paint the accused as emotionally fragile, manipulated by lies and half-truths, and claimed that the shooting had been a crime of passion rather than a premeditated act. But their narrative faltered under the weight of damning details: cell phone records showing carefully coordinated movements, surveillance footage of the shooter circling the school parking lot for nearly 20 minutes before Romeca arrived, and the discovery of a hidden firearm in the trunk of their car, wiped clean of fingerprints but traced to a recent purchase. The prosecution argued that this was not the behavior of someone who snapped in a moment of rage. It was the blueprint of a calculated killing. As the trial pressed on, Romeca's family sat stoically in the gallery, clutching framed photos of her beaming smile. Each testimony seemed to reopen their wounds, forcing them to relive the horror of that morning, when Romeca had simply been trying to drop her child off at school, unaware that she was walking straight into an ambush. Reporters captured their silent grief, and the story spread like wildfire across Chicago and beyond, sparking debates about domestic violence, jealousy-driven crimes, and how invisible signs of danger can lurk behind the most ordinary routines. When closing arguments began, the prosecution delivered a haunting summary, methodically tying every thread back to the motive of jealousy and betrayal. They reminded the jury that this was not just about a fleeting affair. It was about obsession, consuming logic, until it turned lethal. The defense made one last desperate plea, asking the jury to see a broken heart, not a cold-blooded killer, but their words felt hollow after weeks of unrelenting evidence. The jury deliberated for only 6 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous: guilty on all counts. A cry broke from Romeca's mother as the courtroom erupted in both sobs and silence. Justice had been served, but it was a hollow victory because nothing could bring Romeca Meeks back. The story that had started as whispers of love and jealousy had ended as a stark reminder of how betrayal can turn deadly, leaving only shattered lives in its wake. In the weeks following the guilty verdict, the city of Chicago seemed to collectively exhale. But for Romeca Meeks' loved ones, the pain lingered like an unhealed wound. The sentencing hearing became yet another emotional battlefield, dragging the family back into the storm they so desperately wanted to escape. The courtroom was quieter this time, the frenzy of reporters less chaotic, but the weight of grief was even heavier. Victim impact statements were read aloud, each one piercing the air with raw sorrow. Romeca's sister spoke through trembling lips, describing how their once vibrant household had been reduced to silence, how holidays now felt hollow, and how Romeca's child still woke up crying at night, calling for a mother who would never come home. The prosecution pushed for the maximum sentence, arguing that the crime had not been a spontaneous outburst, but the product of meticulous planning fueled by jealousy and spite. They replayed the haunting footage once more, the accused waiting in their car near the school, engine idling, eyes fixed on the entrance as children streamed inside. They reminded the court of the damning text messages retrieved from the accused's phone, cold calculated lines that read like the steps of a grim checklist. Wait till she's alone. No witnesses. The defense, visibly defeated, attempted to argue for leniency on grounds of emotional instability. They presented psychological evaluations, painting the convicted as someone overwhelmed by obsessive love and unable to control their impulses. But the judge remained unmoved. In a voice that cut through the courtroom like steel, she declared that passion could never justify extinguishing a life, especially that of a mother devoted to her child. She sentenced the killer to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The gavel's strike echoed like a gunshot, final and absolute. Outside, Romeca's family embraced one another, tears streaming freely. They spoke softly to the press, saying they felt no joy in the punishment, only relief that the person who had torn their world apart could no longer harm anyone else. Yet even in that moment, the absence of Romeca loomed like a shadow. Her child, too young to fully comprehend death, clung to a relative's leg, asking if Mommy can come now. That single question shattered even the most stoic hearts. In the months that followed, memorials sprang up around the school where Romeca had taken her final steps. Flowers, teddy bears, and handwritten notes lined the fence, a quiet testimony to the impact she had left on her community. Neighborhood mothers organized candlelight vigils, speaking out against domestic jealousy and violence, determined that her death would not be in vain. Though the trial was over and justice served in the eyes of the law, the story of Romeca Meeks remained etched in the city's memory.